Our guest in this segment is a guest we've had on the program before, former chief scientist at NOAA, Craig McLean. Craig, good morning to you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me back.
Mr. Stubblefield now has your official introduction.
Yeah, well, Craig, as Rob said, you've been on with us 2 or 3 times, Craig. One, most recently, talking about the health of the oceans. Before that, you appeared when that sub that was diving on the Titanic had a disastrous ending. You gave us some insight.
That's submersible you're talking about?
Submersible, yeah. You gave us insight of what might have happened. Greg has done a lot of diving in the world's oceans, including diving on the Titanic 2 or 3 times. He's a man of many accomplishments. I've known Greg for probably 40, 45 years in various capacities. He's a lawyer. He's an adventurer. He's a phenomenal manager. In addition to being chief scientist of NOAA, he is also in charge of NOAA's atmospheric oceanographic research. He had probably several thousand people reporting to him, I should say, and is very much engaged with the broad breadth of work that NOAA was doing. I asked Craig to come and talk to us today for one reason. We're hearing a lot of layoffs, downsizing in various agencies, Social Security, USAID, education, go across the board, you hear a lot of layoffs or downsizing. We don't hear as much about the impacts as what we've been hearing about the actual people being laid off. NOAA has received some layoffs, not as many as others. The layoffs have been concentrated in National Weather Service, National Hurricane Research Center, fisheries. But what has not been mentioned are the work that's dealing with climate change. Most of us feel that the oceanographic atmospheric research that deals with climate change will eventually have a bullseye on their back, and that's when we see impact there. But the questions I'd like to ask Greg to start with was the impact that we're having with the current layoffs, with the weather balloons, and the fishery stock assessments and the like. So, Craig, welcome back. Always great to talk with you, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks very much for having me once again, and I appreciate the questions that you're asking and the show that you and Rob and colleagues have put on here for a good number of years. If I look at the questions that you're raising right now, what are the impacts? The problem that I see is that the impact will not be measured for a few weeks, a few months, for a while. And once those impacts are measured and the public feels them, in order to restore the agency to a manner in which it has historically performed, it will take a long time to build it back again. So if I could expound on that, I'll explain a bit what I mean. The tools that have been used now to reduce the size of the federal workforce, and I'll focus on NOAA because that's really the agency that I know, the tools that are being used are rather blunt and clumsy, and they are reducing people just to achieve a numerical reduction in the number of federal workers, rather than any strategic assessment as to what positions might be of a first order to preserve, maybe a second order to preserve, et cetera. So just like your colleague who's joining you who had a career in emergency management and emergency response, there are certain things that in a triage order you take care of first. And that's not being done here. So the likelihood, if not the promise, of the greatest of damage to the missions that the agency performs are upon us. What are those missions? You've mentioned several. The National Weather Service is where the public runs into NOAA and is served by NOAA on a routine basis. But it's not just the weather forecaster sitting at the weather forecast desk. That, as you mentioned, weather balloons and the reduction in the number of balloon launches, those are important components of the weather forecast. But because of the shortage of people, the ability to continue the normal rhythm of launch has been dropped back. The number of people who have experience is being reduced. And something I'll point out in the reductions is the illegal, and I'll stress illegal because 2 courts have already reversed the illegal firing of probationary employees. In a conventional sense, a probationary employee might invite the conclusion that this person needs to be watched carefully. because they may not have yet proven themselves. Maybe their performance is not adequate. They're put on probation. That is not what federal probationary employees are. Because we want to protect the public's interest, the rules of federal employment have required that any person new to any position, someone who may have been there for 2 decades and promoted to the next higher position, is probationary for a year. And it is these people that have been selected out and were illegally fired simply on the basis that they were probationary. There are only 2 ways to terminate an employee who's on probation: if their conduct is poor or if their performance is poor, but not because they're simply probationary. And those are the simple terms upon which the court reversed these decisions. But those people are sitting home right now. They're on administrative leave. They're getting paid. They don't have access to their email, and they can't work. So the idea of bringing these people back just in title, but not to allow them to do their work, is very damaging to the performance of the mission and morally exhausting to the people who this has been done to.
Not to mention it's inefficient. If we're trying to save money, paying people to not work is generally not one of the ways you do that.
Well, we're doing that twice, Rob. We're doing that for the illegally fired probationary employees, and that's roughly, and let's dive into this in a minute, but that's roughly between 600 and 800 NOAA employees. And then there's also the folks who took what is called the Deferred Resignation Program. And those were the people who were offered the, as you may have recalled it, titled the Fork in the Road Memorandum. And that was between 400 and 500 people that took that. Now, those people, as of late winter, early spring, leave the government, they stay home, and they get paid through the balance of the fiscal year. They get paid to do nothing. So there's yet another inefficiency, surely to be bringing down the numbers of the people on board in the agency. Now, I can't tell you, I don't think anyone can tell you the exact number of people who have accepted either of these situations or have been impacted by these situations, because number one, the agency, NOAA, has not announced the number of people who were A, illegally terminated, B, took the deferred resignation program, or any other measure of how many people has the agency been reduced by. And that's for 2 reasons. One is, my understanding is that the political oversight, the political appointees who are at NOAA, don't want those numbers out. But I think there's also a complication between the confusion between NOAA and its parent department, the Department of Commerce. They don't really know how many people have been swept up in all of this, and they're still in the process of scurrying about to try and figure this out. Now, when you're down, as some of the components of NOAA are, 35% of your employees, as I say, because these blind instruments of reduction have been applied, not strategic analysis. When you're down 35%, as some of the personnel components of the agency are, it's pretty hard to keep tabs on everything that's going on with each of these very confusing transactions. So in a word, this is the greatest mess I have ever seen in my 42 years of government service. Now, today is the anniversary of my retirement 3 years ago. So I'm a bit dated, but I spent 42 years in NOAA in uniform, serving with Admiral Stubblefield, and then also as a civilian. I have never seen anything like this.
Craig, the individuals are all suffering. We realize that, but it's we tend to, if we're not one of those individuals, we see it as more of a detached element. What I would like to do is to bring it back to home, to us that are not the employee that's been directly affected. And I was going to use the weather balloons as an example. We're going into tornado seasons. We're going into the season of severe storms in the Midwest, the severe storms going through West Virginia. How critical are the reduction of the weather balloons going to be on that? Hurricane season's coming up. A little bit farther afield would be our fish in the seas and how we're not managing the fishery stock like we should. So I'm looking for some direct impacts to us as folks living in Martinsburg, West Virginia.
Well, you have a wonderful, wonderful community in Martinsburg, and you even have some extended colleagues who I think are still part of that community but live elsewhere. I want to give a shout out to Scott McKellar down in South Carolina, who's very much a part of this. And Scott was one of the very loyal people who worked in NOAA with you and I, Admiral, for a long time. There are many people who are like that and many who live in and around Martinsburg, a lot of former feds. I think they would realize, as every other citizen, that you depend daily on the quality of your weather forecast. Look at Asheville down in Carolina and the inundation and deluge that they endured. It's not just, is it going to rain, as a question that promotes the safety of life and property, but it's a question of how much will it rain, how long will it rain, and where will that rain go? Can we accommodate that? So the notion of hydrology and the science of the water that's dumped from the rain is another aspect of meteorology, the science of weather. The weather forecast, because of the reductions in people and the reductions in experience, the weather forecasts will degrade to roughly where we were in the 1970s. And that's not bad, but that's not where we are today, and that's not the level of skill that we have today. So the citizen will still get a weather forecast, and that information will still be available to the Weather Channel, to AccuWeather, and each of the other handheld devices that can deliver the products of other companies. The information will be coming, but the information will be degraded. It will not be as precise and as accurate, and the skill of the forecast will be reduced. So you'll get a forecast, but it won't be as good as the one that you got yesterday. The idea, and Bill, you mentioned climate as well, the translation of these reductions in the agency service to the citizen is going to translate into a higher cost of living. And here's why. The information that NOAA collects on weather and on the ocean drives the weather, we know that, and what happens in the Indian Ocean helps the farmer in Iowa, Indiana, Kansas decide what crops to plant and when to plant based on how that season is going to flow, because we've made the measurements on the other side of the ocean. So as we do less of this, because the ships can't operate at the same tempo as we did before these reductions, because the information and the engineers that service these systems and devices, both in the field, in satellites, in operating and managing the satellites, these are being degraded because we are canceling contracts that allow the commercial sector to provide service to the agency to do this work. So we're getting rid of federal employees. We're canceling contracts that are blindly chosen simply on keyword searches that are made by the Doge teams. And we wind up knocking things out without any strategic outlook. So what does that do? That will cost us money because it will bring greater risk and greater uncertainty. We won't know what's going to happen or how bad it's going to happen with the same precision we have today. So what happens then? My insurance rates go up, and so do yours. What we wind up then seeing is that the cost of transportation goes up because the idea of having good information to route the transportation of goods is being compromised. The cost of food would go up because we're going to have lesser efficiency in the crops that are planted, and the cost of what we buy, even though it comes from somewhere else, by the time it's shipped to Martinsburg, that's going to cost more. You're going to pay for that risk. And we're all going to pay more for insurance because that's pooled. It's distributed across the entire risk profile. And the reinsurers use NOAA's data daily in order to calculate and compute what the future risk situation is going to look like, whether it's coastal, whether it's in the hills, or whether it's in the mountains. So, and also to be insuring the crops that are grown as well. So this gets translated and passed on to us. It makes a nice billboard appearance that we're reducing the size of government, but it negates the notion of the noble service that has been well established for years in federal service, and that stereotypical person who is sitting behind a luxurious cubicle shopping for a car on government time. In my entirety of 42 years in government, if I saw 10 people that had those habits, I promise you we got rid of them, and that is not the type of people that work for the United States government, many of whom are in your listing area out in Martinsburg.
Yeah, great. Let me follow up on a question that's asked by one of our panelists. One of our listeners said it's her understanding, I think this is shared by several, that several of the people who were terminated because they're on probation had taken a long time to hire because they could not find someone who met the qualifications of these positions, then turned around and fired them. You had made a point earlier that on probation, due to the fact you were one of the stars and were promoted to a more more senior position. Or I know some cases went from a contractor to for several years and to an employee. Again, they were on probation for a while. I guess my question was, this listener felt that the individuals that were fired were really not qualified to do the job.
Oh, that's very wrong. That's very wrong. First of all, any federal hire is based on merit. That is the criterion of selection, merit. Does the person have the resume, the demonstrated experience, the character to be serving the public in these positions? So the people who had been terminated illegally because of the probationary status, in many cases, they had worked with NOAA in NOAA laboratories, but under the employ of either a university or a commercial company that basically was a recruitment facility to go ahead and find talented people to come in and work for the government, to work with the government. And then as federal positions would become open, many of these labeled probationary employees competed for, and on a merit basis, they were selected and awarded the positions. But because they hadn't been in those positions for a year, they were selected for termination. The idea that folks have worked for decades in order to get some of these federal positions is very real, and they are remarkably experienced. I'll give you a few examples. We had the hurricane mission directors. Now, these are the people who, in the blue jumpsuit, are in the back of the airplane flying through a hurricane. Bill, you've done that. I've done that. It's a remarkable experience, and you realize what talent is in the aircraft. The mission director tells the pilots where the airplane should go, and the pilots then skillfully navigate the plane with the safety of the people on board in mind and make the measurements that you and I need to know where that hurricane is going to go or how fast it's going to accelerate and intensify. The two of the three mission directors were terminated because they were probationary employees. It takes years of being in the back of that airplane in different jobs in order to become the mission director. But just blindly, they were selected because they were probationary. So the notion that the folks who were these probationary employees were anything less than the superlative descriptions that they deserve is false.
Hi, good morning. This is John Gilstrap. Yeah, it's difficult to talk about these things in an objective way with people who I don't think can be all that objective. This is clearly near and dear to your heart, and I tend to be agnostic because I've never worked for the government. I've always worked for private sector where people get fired all the time simply because there's not enough money to pay them. We lose contracts. The priorities change. Sometimes, I've worked for government contracts, and new administrations come in and they say, "Oops, sorry, we're not going to make that widget anymore. You're fired." And yeah, we work for a long time to get in that position. The job goes away, and there you go. That's just kind of the way it operates. There's a lot of certainty in what I hear you saying, and I know it comes from your heart about the catastrophizing of what's going to happen when all these changes happen, but there's really no certainty in what's going to happen. I pulled up the NOAA website here, and there's an 82-page document that I've not seen before, to be honest with you, so I think I'm interpreting it right, that NOAA has a $6.5 billion budget projected for 2025. How much work can get done for $4.5 billion or $3.5 billion? I'm going to guess some of this. The nation's bleeding to death and financially, and I'm not asking you to answer to this, just kind of my knee-jerk reaction to a lot of what I hear from agency heads and from people who have worked for these agencies will stipulate that all the work is very, very important, and all the work still needs to get done. The work needs to get done in a different way, and because we cannot afford to do it the way we've been doing it, we just can't. So smart people, and maybe these aren't the right smart people. I'll stipulate to that too. But I think, I don't know if there's a question in here or not. I get really nervous when I hear people are upset, and I know that they're upset, but all of the energy that's going into the grousing of what's being lost instead of the redirection of, well, okay, this is what's left, and how do we now make it work? That's the shift that has to happen here somewhere.
I think your initial question was, you got $6.5 billion. Can't you make $4.5 billion work? In other words, where can you cut?
Yeah, where are the cuts? What can we do without, because you can't have it all anymore? There's a question.
And I got about 3 minutes for you.
Okay, so John, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the objectivity of the question. So what can you do 6.5 versus 4.5? 3 years ago, I testified before the House Science Committee, and I made the statement that NOAA is a $12 billion agency trapped in a $5.5 billion budget. So the agency has got up $1 more billion. Can you operate the agency for less? Of course. We did years ago. You're turning the clock back, and we're turning the agency back to technologies and mission performance that is less than what we enjoy today. And to address your question of how do you change, you don't do it with a chainsaw. You don't come into an agency and just blindly stop performing certain activities without analyzing them. In the 40-some years that I was in government, several times did we go through strategic reductions. In the Clinton administration, there were strategic reductions that were debated richly, and many of those suggested were analyzed and implemented. Some of those that were suggested were analyzed and rejected. But you do it with critical analysis, and that's a skill that people hire for in government and in private sector. Critical analysis, not just at the starting gun, run towards a target and hit it as hard as you can. That's pretty much what we've got going on here, is just cutting and breaking, and then hoping that we could add back what is necessary. You make the cuts deliberatively after sufficient critical analysis. There is zero of that going on here. That's not my passion. That's my objective analysis after having spent 42 years doing that kind of work for the government.
Follow up, John. I've got a minute left.
No, not really. But that's already done. I mean, it's not. You can't roll back the time. So the hand's been dealt.
But the approach can be redone. And Craig mentioned the Clinton administration. We reduced substantial. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but a substantial reduction was done during the Clinton administration.
I believe Riley Moore said it was 357,000 during one of his interviews on TV.
Yeah, I've forgotten exactly, but it was surgically done as opposed to just brute force. It's hard pressed to say, can we survive a hurricane season without putting folks at risk with the cuts that have been made?
Greg, I want to thank you very much for your time. We are out of it at the moment, but I appreciate it, and we look forward to your next appearance on the program, sir.
Thank you, Rob, John, and Bill. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Craig. Appreciate it much.
Craig McLean, former chief scientist at NOAA, colleague of the Admiral, Mr. Stubblefield, during their